Over Hearthstone's 10-year lifespan, there's been a lot of really good cards and a lot of really bad cards over the course of over 33 different expansions. And here I have a PowerPoint going over every single one and showing you what is the best and worst card from each different expansion. Let's go. My pick for the best card from the Legacy set is Sylvanas Windrunner. This powerful 6-drop neutral legendary minion has so many broken drawbacks that you still can't see in the game today, basically being the 10 mana spell Mind Control on a 6 mana minion. It provides good stats, it's got a super powerful death rattle, and it could see play in tons of decks due to it being only 6 mana, meaning it could be the top end for a mid-range deck, or the top end for a control deck, or the top end for an aggro deck. It basically fits anywhere, and it originally cost 5 mana, which seems completely broken compared to now. Two honorable mentions from the Legacy set are Ragnaros the Firelord and Iceblock. Ragnaros is another classic Legacy minion that is super powerful, large legendary neutral minion, when in many control, aggro, and mid-range decks, just does a bunch of damage, has RNG, it's kind of the classic Hearthstone card, Hall of Fame for a reason. Hearthstone couldn't go without Ragnaros. Iceblock, on the other hand, is probably the best secret ever introduced to Hearthstone, basically giving you an extra turn, and the fact that it was an epic means that you could play up to 2 in your deck. This, only being a mage card, had to get Hall of Famed, unlike almost any other card in the Legacy set, just because of how broken Iceblock truly is. Funnily enough, my pick for the worst card in the entire Legacy set is Loreworker Cho, a card that was actually nerfed going into the beta. Now, Loreworker Cho used to be a 1/4 and actually had a pretty decent stat line and would cause annoyance to your opponent by being in play. But after they removed that 1 attack power, Loreworker Cho basically did nothing when played on the board and was only symmetrical, meaning that it would benefit you and your opponent about the same. This card would be playable if it had stat buffs, but after it got nerfed, it basically saw no play until it rotated out. On to Curse of Naxxramas. The pretty obvious best card in my opinion is Loatheb. This card was just insane in all the formats it was in. Extends aggro boards, stopping combos from happening, stopping board wipes from killing your boards in an aggro deck, being a good mid-range threat, being even playable in control decks as just a well-statted good body. There's basically no deck that you couldn't put Loatheb in this time and have it be a bad card. Looking at pure power, you could probably say that Undertaker was a stronger card in comparison to Loatheb, being that it got +1/+1 every time you played a Death Rattle, and having a 3/4 minion that attacks on turn 2 after playing 2 Death Rattles with your Undertaker was simply too much for any early Hearthstone deck to handle. This led to a 60% win rate in the Death Rattle Hunter deck, meaning that you could easily kill your opponent on turn 5 if you just played Undertaker, let alone if you played 2 in the early game. This card got nerfed to only 1 attack, which basically meant it saw no more play afterwards, which is why I haven't had it in the top slot compared to Loatheb. The other most iconic and broken card from Curse of Naxxramas is Voidcaller. Being only a Warlock card, it only had a certain amount of reach, but being able to cheat out basically any demon in the entire game for the entire time it was illegal basically made this card a must play in almost all Warlock decks. Being 4 mana, you could play it at the top end of your aggro deck to summon out Doom Guards that would charge your opponent in the face, or you could play it in control deck, slam it down on 4, and then have a large taunt demon at the end of your game that would be able to stop your opponent from killing you. The worst card I've picked for Naxxramas is gotta be Stoneskin Gargoyle. This is a 3 mana 1/4 minion, which is already probably one of the worst statted minions in the entire game, not to mention that the effect only works if he takes damage and survives, which he probably won't be seeing, as that he has 2 less stats than almost all 3 mana minions at this time. This card never saw any play, and the idea that it could is probably laughable comparison to the bad cards of nowadays. The most powerful and iconic card from the super power creep Goblin vs. Gnome, I would say, is Dr. Boom. Dr. Boom was a card that didn't really look too powerful when you looked at it, but when you compare it to the other 7 drops of the time, being a 9/9 at the absolute worst for 7 mana was something that basically all decks would want. Not to mention that the Boom bots did additional damage to your opponent's face, meaning that in aggro or mid-range decks, your control opponent would have a very hard time dealing with the random damage that would get spread if they were to clear the board. Not to mention that because of there being both a big body and 2 small bodies, it was both hard to clear with a lot of spells, but also hard to clear with 1 Wrath spell, as the cards with the Death Rattles would deal a lot of damage to your face and put a lot of pressure on you from an aggro or a mid-range deck. Even control decks would play Dr. Boom, as it was just the best thing to do on 7 mana, and that is why I think it is the best card in GVG. You can really see where the power creep starts in Goblins vs. Gnomes, the first real expansion to Hearthstone, because there are so many unique and powerful cards that got introduced that changed the way the game was played. Muster for Battle was one of the most powerful swarm effects for Paladin, and really identified as Paladin as the swarm class, even more than it already was. Giving you a 1 mana weapon and 3 1/1s was basically negative mana worth of value, and it gave you great stats on the board, so that way you could easily pressure your opponent for the whole game. Implosion, being basically the cornerstone of all zoo decks, happened for a really long time just because the random amount of 2 to 4 damage could usually clear a minion on your opponent's side of the board and summon a large board for yourself at basically no cost. If you rolled 4 on Implosion every time, it would have probably been the best card in the game every single time, and this randomness really spoke to why Hearthstone became known as the game with all the randomness in it. The neutral minions certainly didn't let up in Goblins vs Gnomes, and Piloted Shredder is a key example of the absolute best 4-drop that you could possibly play in almost any deck. Being a 4-mana 6/5 on average, with half of it being from the Death Rattle making it hard to remove, made it so that way almost any mid-range aggro or control deck could put Piloted Shredder in, and then have a large bodied threat that you could just slam on 4, help clear the board, or help push damage to your opponent's face. This is another card with a ton of RNG, being that you could get a 0/7 Doomsayer that clears your entire board, or a 4/4 off of the body of the Death Rattle, making it so that way this was also adding to the reputation of RNG in Hearthstone. A final card that I have quite the soft spot for is Anti-Healbot, being a neutral healing option that basically didn't exist until Goblins vs Gnomes came out. This card saw a bunch of play in slow mage, warlock, or warrior control decks, being able to reset your life total at very low cost and having a reasonably sized body that you could play in almost any slow control deck. The absolute most memed on and worst card from Goblins vs Gnomes has to be Bulwark Dragon. This card is so unbelievably bad, I don't know why they put it even in the set. Being a 5-mana 1/7 is a horrible stat line, and the idea of the card is you're supposed to hold it in your hand so that way you can build up its power and then have a large 5-mana threat. However, no matter how big Bulwark gets, he still dies to a basic kill spell from your opponent in a control deck, and in an aggro deck, you don't want to hold a random 5-drop in your hand from the beginning of the game to the end of the game when you had to finally slam him down. Not to mention that if you ever draw this card after turn 4, he literally does nothing. He's just a 1/7. This card has never ever seen any play and basically became the laughingstock of the Hearthstone community when it came out in GVG. Blackrock Mountain was a smaller set and definitely did impact the game, but the card that definitely impacted the most has to be Emperor Thaurissan. This card was game-breaking when it came out, enabling new combos that were never before possible because you never had this much mana cheat on a single card. Not to mention that a 6-mana 5/5 was pretty decent stats at the time, so you could slam this guy down, apply pressure to the board, while also discounting your combo or late-game focused decks. This card saw play in control and mid-range decks and definitely enabled a ton of decks with its must-remove threat status by discounting your cards in hand every turn. Emperor Thaurissan was truly revolutionary for the time. With the mid-range and control decks getting such a powerful option in Blackrock Mountain, it makes sense that they introduce some better 3-drops to help push the aggressive strategies of both Warlock and Mage, and we can see this with these two cards here, Flamewaker and Imgank Boss. Flamewaker making a basically entire spell spam deck where you would play early game minions and then spam burn spells at your opponent's face, comboing off of Flamewaker, killing all of your opponent's minions, and also dealing a ton of damage to face. Flamewaker was a classic card from Blackrock Mountain that almost all Temple Mages would play. Imp Gang Boss was almost guaranteed a 3/5 for 3 mana, which is a crazy amount of stats, but not to mention that because the fact that the minions come after the Imp Gang Boss dies, it is both resilient to removal and also super good with buffs. If you were ever to make your Imp Gang Boss bigger, you could summon larger and larger boards and make it harder and harder for them to clear your Zoo board until you overwhelmed your opponent with your Zoo Warlock deck. Though a lot of people saw the stat line of 4 mana 5/6 in Blackrock Mountain and thought that that would be a good enough card to see play, the downside of Hungry Dragon simply made it too bad to actually see any play. Despite it being a dragon, despite it being 4 mana, it looks like it should be good, but that 1 mana card basically giving your opponent a free option for how to help clear your board, and the fact that it simply dies to 4 mana removal spells anyway for the cost, it simply gives your opponent too much flexibility and too much downside for this card to be willing to see play, especially compared to other cards like Piloted Shredder that we saw in the previous expansion. The Grand Tournament is one of the weakest expansions Hearthstone has ever seen, but there was one card that definitely stood above the rest as being the most iconic and powerful of the time, and that is Mysterious Challenger. The good stats for the cost being a 6 mana 6/6 already presents a threat, but it functionally becomes a 9/8 after only 2 Seekers. Avenge, which gives your minion +3/+2 when a friendly minion dies, and Noble Sacrifice, which summons a 1/2 that blocks an attack from your opponent, guaranteeing that your Avenge will trigger. Only these 2 secrets made this card already a 9/8 basically worth of stats, which is good enough to see play in a Paladin deck, not to mention other secrets that you could put in that would help make your deck even more powerful. This basically made the Secret Paladin a deck, and this was the super powerful top end card that you would slam at the end of the game to finish your opponent off. Though there weren't many other powerful cards in the Grand Tournament, Living Roots as a Druid card gave a lot of optionality to both combo Druids and to token Druids, being able to summon 2 1/1 saplings to apply pressure early game to your opponent, and being a 2 damage burst in your control or combo decks, being able to help clear the board or push damage to face when it was necessary. There's not really much to say about Totem Golem besides the fact that it was a 2 mana 3/4 with good stats for the cost. Even though it gave you an Overlord 1, this Overlord actually ended up helping you more often than not thanks to Overlord synergies in the Shaman class. Not to mention that being a totem also had other synergies with other cards in the Shaman class. This card is just a perfect fit into any Shaman deck. Almost all of them played it just because of the good stats for the cost. Continuing the trend of legendary minions that really aren't worth the dust, we have Bolf Ramshield. He has 9 health and 3 power, which actually isn't that bad of a stat line. However, he takes damage when you take damage, which leads to the fact that Bolf actually has no power, because your opponent can simply hit you in the face and then Bolf takes the damage. The fact that this card dies from taking damage is really an example of why TGT cards were just completely useless. This card had basically no play and has really no application in almost any deck. In League of Explorers, we are introduced to many iconic Explorer cards, but the most iconic for me has to be Reno Jackson. This card made an entire new archetype all by himself because of his incredibly powerful effect to heal you to absolutely full health from nothing if you had the 6 mana and had fulfilled his deck building requirement. All archetypes from this point on are known as Reno decks because Reno was simply so strong that it forced you to remove all the duplicates of cards in your deck just so that way you could have that 6 mana full heal. Against aggro decks, this was an absolute crushing play on 6, leading to you being able to live much longer, and against combo decks, this will help you take out of range of their combo plays. This card is incredibly iconic and is definitely the best card in League of Explorers. Going with the theme of the Explorers being really strong, Bran Bronzebeard, though it wasn't as powerful as it would later end up being, was a super strong card when it first came out anyway. Being able to double trigger all of your powerful battle cries definitely made it so that you must answer Bran Bronzebeard when it was played on the board, and even if you did answer him, sometimes your opponent could combo him with battle cry minions right away to get some instant value out of Bran. Though he would become a menace in the future, when he came out he was still a very decent threat and must answer powerful card. Finley, another really well designed card, definitely helped out the aggro decks of the classes that had less aggressive leaning hero powers. Classes like Mage or Warrior that had hero powers that were good but not suited towards the aggro game style could definitely play Finley in their deck and then switch to a later game draw option using life tap or a later game damage option using the steady shot. Sir Finley Merlithin was one of the most powerful cards in aggro decks and would see long play alongside Warrior in Warrior aggressive strategies. One of the most talked about cards in League of Explorers has to be the Cursed Blade. A 1 mana 6 damage card sounds incredibly powerful but comes with an incredibly detrimental downside of you taking double damage, leading to that way if you were ever in an aggro matchup, Cursed Blade would actually end up punishing you incredibly hard. And though when you were in these control matchups it was very powerful to be able to deal all that damage to face, the fact that it took 3 turns to do it and during those turns you couldn't equip any other weapons led to it being worse than other weapons that you could play that simply dealt more damage in less time. Cursed Blade, though it looks enticing, is cursed for a reason and definitely was the worst card in League of Explorers. Though at the beginning of expansion, lots of people thought this wouldn't be the best card in the expansion, it became very clear over time that Yogg-Saron Hope's End is the best Wizard of the Old cards ever printed and is extremely powerful. Even though the effect is incredibly random, the Yogg usually led to you at least clearing the board and adding some cards to your hand in terms of value, only needing to have 5 or so effects, so that way you could usually lead to the board being cleared and lead to your hand getting refilled with either card draw or card generation. Not to mention that Yogg-Saron both has the incredible upside to instantly win you the game when you play him if things go well. And even though there was a downside that you could have games that were winnable that you ended up losing, you could simply not play the Yogg-Saron and wait for the game to be in a position where you were forced to. Being able to win games that were basically unwinnable from any other position thanks to the Yogg-Saron led to it seeing tons of play in tons of decks. Druid, Rogue, Mage, almost any deck could play Yogg-Saron if they were able to get to that 10 mana final play, and this led to a very, very iconic randomness of Hearthstone becoming a core part of the game once again. Whispers of the Old Gods was another set that had tons of power creep with tons of the Old Gods changing up the way the game was played. However, Fandral Staghelm has to be one of the most powerful legendaries ever seen for Druid. Having almost all of your choose one cards, many of which have already seen tons of play and are very good, be combined into double answer threats, basically made it so that way Fandral saw play in almost every single Druid deck as both a value and tempo option. Not to mention that 4 mana 3/5 is good stats for the time, and it must be answered because the more cards that you play that have both the sides on them, the more cards you get that will also have both of the effects combined. Builds massive large boards, a must-answer threat, and gives huge value to all the Druid decks, and it is a perfect card to ramp into on 3. Another one of the most iconic cards from Witch of the Old Gods has to be Flamewreath Faceless. This huge 4 mana 7/7 had the biggest stat line we could see on 4 mana for a long time. Only Overload 2, which actually helps enable Overlord synergies in the Shaman deck, led to that way this card would see play in any aggro or mid-range Shaman strategy, completely bulldozing anything else that could come in his way. This card was extremely difficult to remove and basically stomped your opponent for 7 damage every time it came into play. This card is why a 4 mana 7/7 became a meme in the community, and you can really see why. It seems pretty crazy that they would print a 4 mana 7/7 in a set, and then they would also print a 8 mana 6/7 in the set for neutral. It just goes to show that Shaman is the one that's supposed to get all of the good stats for the cost cards. The Boogie Monster has not only horrible stats, but the ability it relies on the stats and being good, meaning that you have to both not only attack your opponent with the 8-drop that you just played, you also have to have a good minion to trade into. This card has so many conditions on it for no reason, and its stats are already bad. There is no reason to play the Boogie Monster, and it was probably just there because they wanted to put another legendary in for you to waste your dust on. The power just keeps on rolling as we get from set to set, and One Night of Karazhan is no exception. Though there were many powerful cards in this set, the one that I'm picking for the best is Arcane Giant. This neutral payoff for spell spam, where it fits perfectly with the Yogg-Saron from the last set that we saw, and also goes great in those Druid and Rogue decks that love to cast lots of low-cost spells and then slam down this massive 8/8 body for very, very low cost. Mana reduction is an overpowered mechanic in Hearthstone, and every time you can get a 0 mana or 1 mana 8/8 down on the board in your turn 5 or turn 6, this card has to be thought about. I'm pretty sure this card will still see tons of play today as it is right now. It is incredibly powerful. Arcane Giant is just a classic powerful giant. Maelstrom Portal, while it wasn't the most powerful card when it came out, would gain a lot of power later and definitely helped with both aggro decks and being the aggro deck. If you were an aggro deck with Maelstrom Portal, you could play it to both develop your board and inflict damage to your opponent, making it harder for them to clear your board. However, it also helped against aggro decks, as the damage being AoE led to you being able to clear their large board and build a large board for your own. Because Shaman also has natural spell damage coming from his hero power, this card could often clear larger boards than were expected if the hero tower totem was rolled to be spell damage. Another super powerful card, especially in the day of, was Malcasar's Imp. This basically made it worth it for you to put discard cards in your deck and basically made the archetype on its own. Discarding a card and drawing a card basically made it so all of your discard cards had basically no downside. Not to mention a 1 mana 1/3 is great stats for the cost and helps with this tempo zoo aggro deck and must be cleared. This is the best payoff for discard has ever seen, and it continues to see play through Wild and all throughout the future of Hearthstone just because drawing a card when you discard a card is that good. In One Night in Karazhan, the worst card absolutely has to be Morose. This card is a 3 mana 1/1, which is already extremely poor stats. However, it doesn't help itself by making other 1/1 minions every single turn. This not only plays harder into sweepers, which are the one thing Morose definitely doesn't want to see, these also extremely poor stats only come over an increasingly long period of time, giving your opponent more time to answer Morose. Morose basically saw no play, and because this minion was simply too small and too weak, would never see any play in any decks or Hearthstone's history. Even though Morose seems pretty iconic, I think he's really, really bad, and I wish they had done something better with this card because it just seems like a waste of time to me. Here we reach the true power creep of what is probably the best card in the entire game, and it comes from Mean Streets of Gadgetzan. It is Patches the Pirate. Patches the Pirate is a free statted card that costs you almost nothing to put in your deck other than adding any pirate in the entire game to your deck that you want to play. It gives you extra burst because originally Patches the Pirate had charge and was forced to be nerfed so that way it wouldn't have the charge. This card was so good that people would play South Sea Captain in their deck and effectively have a 3 mana 5/5 in their deck just with the Patches plus the South Sea Captain. Not to mention that the 2/2 of it had charge thanks to Patches having charge and the buffed of stats. This card saw unbelievable amounts of play and warped the entire metagame around the fact that Patches the Pirate could be played in almost any deck and gave you simply more stats for the cost on pirates than any other minion in the entire game. Patches is truly absurd and would be broken in any single card game it was printed in. This card is insane. Patches clearly takes number 1 as the most broken card in the game. However, Kazakus is definitely another powerful card that saw tons of play throughout all of Mean Streets of Gadgetzan. It being a Highlander payoff meant it worked perfectly with all of the controlling, slow Reno decks that love to have lots of time, and Kazakus giving you a potion that was both flexible if you were under early game pressure from aggro deck and gave you tons of value in late game scenarios with Bran in a late game control mirror. This card definitely had plenty of application and could easily win you the game solo if you got the right potion. This card is super powerful and was another great reason to play Highlander decks in Hearthstone. Patches wasn't the only complaint of a card that came from Mean Streets of Gadgetzan. Jade Idol has to be one of the most annoying cards to play against if you were a control deck in the entire game. It effectively eliminates the chance that you can run out of cards by just shuffling in Jade Idols over and over again. Not to mention that this actually becomes your win con as the Druid. By shuffling multiple Jade Idols into your deck, you get a larger and larger man every single turn. This card completely enabled the Jade Druid archetype and basically led so that way Jade Druid could always beat you in a late game scenario. Not to mention that 1 mana was cheap stats for the cost, meaning that if you drew this card early, you could still apply board presence in the early game against an aggro deck, even if you didn't need to shuffle more copies into your deck. This card was very strong for very many reasons. While Kazakus and Aya Blackpaw definitely were good heads of their houses, Dawn Honcho left a lot to be desired, being a 7 mana 5/6 that gave another minion in your hand +5/+5. It seems like a lot of stats for your cost, however, 5/5 of those stats are even slower because you need to both play the minion that got it, and you also have to attack with that minion later without it dying, meaning that until at least turn 8, you weren't seeing any of those stats on the board, and being a 7 mana 5/6 is simply too slow to apply any pressure to your opponent. There is simply too much Ditto to make Dawn Honcho work, and this is why this is probably the worst card in all of Mean Streets. The power creep keeps on rolling, and here we have the best card in Journey to Un'Goro, the Caverns Below. This quest, even though it was laughed at in comparison to other quests when it first came out, quickly became one of the most hated cards in the game, as it just was a very simple strategy for Rogue to pull off and simply comboed you to death once the Crystal Core was cast. It was very quick to complete using cards like Shadow Step and Youthful Brewmaster to reset your minions and easily complete the 4 of the same name requirement. This card was forced to be nerfed several times because the 5/5 minions would simply kill you too fast, and the cost was simply too low so that way you could easily get the Crystal Core completed as early as turn 4. This would lead to you dying on turn 5 to a bunch of 1/1 charging boars and was incredibly frustrating to play against. This card, even though it doesn't seem that powerful, would easily kill you all the time. This is the best card in Journey to Un'Goro. Another very hyped, powerful legendary from Journey to Un'Goro was Sunkeeper Tarim. This card would basically see play in any sort of paladin deck, being aggro to mid-range to control, having a big taunt to slow down your opponent and also setting all minions to 3 health, being that Sunkeeper Tarim could easily kill up to 3 minions on your opponent's board by himself. Not to mention, any of the smaller minions you have because you're a paladin deck instantly get buffed up and get to attack for a large amount of damage to face. Any paladin deck would love to have Sunkeeper Tarim, and I'm pretty sure that Sunkeeper Tarim would see play in Hearthstone's modern age. This card was an excellent card that saw play all the way up to rotation. One of the most surprisingly playable cards in Un'Goro had to be Firefly. Though it looks like a payoff for elemental decks, giving you 2 elementals to keep your elemental chain going, this card ended up just being a great card in any aggro or mid-range deck. Being able to play it on turn 1 or turn 2 gave it so that way you would never feel bad if you had a Firefly in your opener. Not to mention, its low mana cost and good stats meant you could fill it in on any other turns that you needed to, or you had an extra mana floating around. Firefly led to that boards would be extra sticky and extra large all the time, having lots of extra gas so that way your aggro and mid-range decks could keep up with board clears and removal spells over the course of the game. Though one of the best quests was one of the easiest to complete in the Crystal Core, the Marsh Green has to be one of the easier cards to complete and yet completely disappointing as a quest. Playing 7 1-cost minions seemed like a really low cost for a Hunter deck, however, the quest reward doesn't easily win you the game when you play it. It only summons a 5 mana 8/8, which is rather large, however, you also took turn 1 off, meaning that the tempo matters a lot less than it would to a combo deck or a control deck. In addition, shuffling 15 Raptors into your deck is nice. The Raptors do draw you a card, and they are 3/2 for 1, which is pretty good stats for the cost. However, you need to wait even more additional turns to draw into these Raptors, which just slowly develop over the board over the time in the game. Not to mention that you put a bunch of 1-drops in your deck to activate this quest, meaning that you really want to win as fast as possible. Skipping turn 1 is simply not good in your aggressive Hunter deck, and you would much rather play any other 1-drop in the game than the Marsh Queen in your aggressive Hunter decks, which was pretty sad for quest enjoyers all around. The best card from many of these last sets can also be compared to the most frustrating card of the last many sets, because the best card from the Knights of the Frozen Throne, in my opinion, is Prince Keleseth. This card is super potent with any 1-drops coming in turn 2 and following up your 1-drop play and buffing your whole deck by a huge amount. This card was incredibly oppressive in Rogue with Shadow Step, being able to bounce back Prince Keleseth and buff your deck multiple times on turn 2, basically leading to an instant win. The low deck building cost of not having any 2-drops doesn't matter when you can play 1-drops like Firefly, which fill the 2-drop slot. Not to mention that most of the powerful cards at 3 and 4 mana can make up for you missing your turn 2 or playing multiple 1-drops on turn 2 instead. If you play this card early, it would provide you huge stats and basically instantly win you the game, which made it super worth giving up your turn 2 play. This card is very powerful and extremely deceptive, as many people thought that giving up 2 mana cards would be too much of a cost. However, aggro decks simply don't need that, just play more 1-drops. From the aggro deck, we now get to go to the powerful control elements that got introduced in Knights of the Frozen Throne, and one of the most powerful has to be Shadow Reaper Anduin. This card would easily clear large minions off your opponent's side of the board and also give you 5 armor, making it incredibly hard to die when you played this card. Then it would replace your hero power from a pretty useless +2 heal to deal 2 damage, which is something any class would kill for as their hero power. Not to mention, this was a repeatable effect, making it so that way you could machine gun down your opponent's small minions that left afterwards the Shadow Reaper Anduin entered the play. This hero power becomes his own win con in the late game, as you can bolster your opponent down and not be forced to play basically any win cons in your control priest deck. This card was an absolute staple in slow priest archetypes. You can't talk about Knights of the Frozen Throne without talking about Ultimate Infestation. This card was an absolute house in any Druid deck, as all Druid decks love to ramp, and all you want to do after you ramp into a large threat is to get your cards back after spending them on ramping. Drawing 5 cards and also helping to both bolster your life total, deal with the board, and apply pressure to your opponent, there was nothing Ultimate Infestation couldn't do. This card saw an absolute ton of play and was an excellent Druid card all the way up till rotation. Following the trend of legendary minions that aren't worth the dust they're printed on, we have Knights of the Frozen Throne's worst card, Marabi. This card is a 6 mana 4/4, which is already horrible stats. However, it has another effect that requires Marabi to stick on the board for multiple turns, which is extremely hard, unless you combo him with a freeze card. However, freeze cards aren't that commonly played in Shaman in the first place, not to mention you have to have another minion that you want to copy that is currently on the board. Shaman has very few freeze effects, very few of which want to see play, not to mention that you don't want to play a 6 mana 4/4 in your deck just when you draw it to combo with that other card and another card on the board. This card has an unbelievable amount of setup. They definitely could have given it better stats just so that way you had a chance of activating Marabi's effect. My pick for the best card in Kobolds and Catacombs has to be Possessed Lackey, which basically influenced and created the Recruit Demon deck on its own. By playing a Possessed Lackey on turn 5, nerf to turn 6, you were able to put a lot of pressure on your opponent. If they killed the Possessed Lackey, you could get a large Void Lord, basically eliminating the odds of you dying in the early game. However, if the Possessed Lackey was left alone, you could get a Doom Guard out if you were to trade it off on your turn and apply a lot of pressure to your opponent's face very quickly. This card was both cheap and a huge threat, which led to many different archetypes and gameplay scenarios which your opponent could not deal with. Possessed Lackey was flexible, powerful, and definitely deserved the nerf. Though Possessed Lackey was probably the strongest card in the set, you could argue for this card, Corridor Creeper, being the true sleeper strongest card in the set. Originally a 7 mana 5/5, this card got discounted by 1 every single time a minion died, and with the amounts of swarmy aggro decks and patches in the metagame, Corridor Creeper often came down on turn 4 as a 0 mana 5/5, leading to games where you would play your Corridor Creeper and your opponent would either have to have their own Corridor Creeper to match, or they would simply lose. This game basically gave late game power against control decks that would clear your board over and over again, restocking your board with a very, very cheap 5/5. Aggro mirrors love this card, aggro against control love this card. This card made aggro super strong in Kobolds and Catacombs. Another card that's worth mentioning in Kobolds and Catacombs is Kobold Librarian, which basically does everything that Warlocks wants to do. It draws you a card, it deals you damage, which has synergy with other cards in Kobolds and Catacombs, and it only costs 1 mana for a well-statted body. This card would basically see play in every Warlock deck from its printing to when it rotated out. Kobold Librarian is just a classic staple card for any Warlock archetype. Another legendary that really isn't worth being played is Temporis. Now, even though it seems like you can do a lot of things by taking 2 turns in a row, not to mention that you take a 3rd turn afterwards by playing Temporis, giving your opponents 2 turns to do whatever they want in a row is simply too much of a cost for how badly statted Temporis is. Being a 7 mana 6/6, you have to wait a long time to play this card, and then you also have to wait for you to have the combo on your turn. Not to mention that you have a very high chance of just immediately losing by giving your opponent 2 turns to set up whatever strategy they are. If they're an aggro deck, you're probably already low and they're going to kill you. If they're a combo deck, they probably already have the combo and can easily use it to kill you. If they're a control deck, they're probably too healthy for your combo to easily kill them from hand. Temporis just has way too many issues because it gives your opponents the turns first. If it was the other way around, it'd be completely broken. However, Temporis is just the kind of card that feels like a cool design that could never really work. The Witchwood was a really interesting set, as most of the cards in the set were really bad. However, there were 2 cards that were absolutely game warping and stood above the rest as probably some of the worst and most powerful designed Hearthstone cards of all time, and that has to be Baku the Moon Eater and Gen Greymane. These 2 cards, even though they are both sitting in the best slot, fit in both different versions of all sorts of decks. In aggro decks, they gave you tons of pressure early, using your early game hero power and early game minions to blast down your opponent in hunter or rogue archetypes. However, even in late game control decks, which like to click their hero power many times over the course of the game, could benefit from either half of these effects. Gen and Baku both saw so much play that they were forced to be rotated out of the game early because they were simply so warping to the metagame that almost every deck had to consider playing it when you started deck building. Gen and Baku are an easy example of why start of game effects that are very powerful must be incredibly careful when put into your video game, because these effects warp the game so much that everyone was forced to play them and craft them. You can't talk about the most powerful cards in the Witchwood without talking about the Shutterwalk. This powerful one card combo would make your opponent want to quit the game by giving you a large amount of battlecry animations over and over again, slowly draining your opponent to death. Shutterwalk not only could provide a large late game threat that bolstered your board state in the late game, but also built an entire combo deck on its own that was no doubt frustrating for opponents to play against. Shutterwalk is iconic for a reason and is definitely one of the most hated cards in the game and most powerful cards from the Witchwood. Another late game threat is Lord Godfrey that comes down and easily clears the board on its own if your opponent is set up correctly, which is Warlock is easy to do as it only costs 7 mana and can be set up in advance. Not to mention that this card both gives you a presence after the fact, being a 4/4 on its own, and also works with your board by having your sticky minions die into late game death rattle threats. The worst card in the Witchwood, and probably one of the worst cards in the entire game, has to be Duskfallen Aviana. This card requires an entire full turn cycle for you to get the 0 mana effect. Giving your opponent a 0 mana card makes it super easy for your opponent to simply kill Aviana and then give you nothing back in return. If you played this card, you also ran the risk of your opponent slamming down a 10 cost card and you instantly losing the game due to the massive board presence gained from your opponent. If they could both play a threat and kill Aviana in the same turn, it was basically an auto loss and you paid 5 mana to lose the game instantly. This card is horrendous. The power creep keeps on coming, and this time it's time for the hero card to be the best card in the set. This is Dr. Boom Mad Genius. This 7 mana card gives all of your mechs rush for the rest of the game, leading to easy board clears for the rest of the game as long as you're playing a control warrior deck, which this deck always would be. Not to mention that it gave you infinite value through all of the 5 different hero powers he would rotate between, giving you mechs in hand, damage, armor, and board presence, all the things that you could possibly want out of a late game deck. This card also gave you a large amount of healing when it played, giving you 7 armor, meaning that it was hard to die the turn you played Dr. Boom. This powerful board clear passive, not to mention infinite value, led to control mirrors that lasted for days and days. This card is incredible and definitely deserved to be nerfed. The Boomsday project also provided another iconic card that definitely held its ground against almost any other deck, and that card is Zilliax. This neutral legendary could go in almost any deck, giving you lifesteal, taunt, rush, and divine shield, basically guaranteeing you 6 life, the removal of a minion. Not to mention that if you were a mech deck, you could magnetize this onto another mech to gain even more life from the lifesteal effect. This card is a super flexible mid-range and control deck option, and it also is super powerful against almost any aggro deck, being a huge issue and a thorn in the sides. This card was so good that you would play it in decks with no mechs as just a well-statted body for the cost. This card was great. Another card that looked rather innocuous and then ended up proving itself in a big way was Giggling Inventor. This card originally cost 5 mana and then got nerfed to 7 and then brought back down to 6 due to its power level being so high. Being a 5 mana 2/1 seems like pretty low stats, but when you add up all the stats from the mechs that come with it as the Annoyotrons, you end up with a relatively well-statted minion that is incredibly difficult to remove. The Divine Shield on the Annoyotrons means that you can't simply use a board clear to get rid of Giggling Inventor and all of its stats, not to mention that they are also mechs for different mech synergies and have 4 hits worth of taunt in your control deck against a powerful aggro strategy. Giggling Inventor was a roadblock against almost any deck and let the control deck being able to last a really long time against any aggro or mid-range strategies. Giggling Inventor was a great card until it was nerfed, and then it saw a lot less play, which is why it's only in the honorable mentions on the list. Another legendary that has to be one of the worst cards in the Boomsday project is Flark's Boomzooka. This card not only gives you a restrictive deck building requirement, wanting you to have large minions with death rattles in your deck so that way when you play the Boomzooka, it summons them and they do damage, or to have their death rattle effect benefit you. It also doesn't go face, which is the one thing that Hunter really loves to do, is hit them in the face. This card for some reason only hits minions and is supposed to be your big late game finisher in your combo deck or tempo deck. Not only does it do that, it also isn't a guaranteed win even if you play it with the death rattle synergy and you draw it early enough that you haven't already drawn them out of your deck. This card has tons of setup and really low payoff. I can't imagine how this card could have worked in the normal game. Maybe if it went face, maybe if it was an aggro finisher, but this card just doesn't fit Hunter at all and definitely is the worst card in the Boomsday project. After all of our power creeping, we have to come back down to Rastakhan's Rumble, which was incredibly weak compared to all the sets around it, and this is one of the best cards in the set is Zul'jin. Being a powerful battle cry for Hunter and being a hero card was very strong, however Rastakhan's Rumble is just really bad and this card wasn't even seeing that much play. Being a 10 cost card that was kind of similar to Yogg-Saron in some ways, recasting all the spells you've played this game was definitely a potent effect and Zul'jin definitely saw play, while Rastakhan's just didn't have that much powerful cards to put in the best card slot. Some honorable mentions for powerful cards from Rastakhan have to be Shrivala the Tiger. This card was good in control archetypes, being able to be a large threat that played late game after you had spent a lot of mana over the course of the game on spells. Though being in Paladin control decks weren't the most common thing ever, so it wasn't tons of play that it saw. Being Divine Life Shield and Rush, it was definitely a good card in those types of archetypes, and also comboed with Holy Wrath to deal 25 damage to your opponent, which was a funny meme from time to time. Grave Horror is my other pick for the honorable mentions and honestly didn't see very much play. However, the fact that it was basically an Arcane Giant, a card I put really high up on the list a few years prior, definitely means that Grave Horror deserves a spot. Even though you couldn't play it in the better classes like Druid or Rogue where it would be very much at home, it definitely still saw play and found a home in a priest deck where you could still spam spells and play a relatively cheap guy, not to mention the fact that he had Taunt, make him good against aggro decks and holding off powerful threats from your opponent. Hyreek the Bat really highlights how bad Rastakhan's Rumble's worst cards were. And even though there's a laundry list of cards that could go here, Hyreek has to take the cake as an 8 mana 1/1. Now even though he basically becomes an 8 mana 7/7 if you have an empty board, this is one thing that still isn't even worth having because it all dies to one single board wipe, not to mention that 7 power for 8 mana is simply not worth the cost. This card is incredibly weak, and even though it was supposed to have synergies with cards that buff your hand, Warlock simply could not pull that off over the course of the game, and also hold on to Hyreek until turn 8 and hope that this large late game minion was enough to take out your opponent. This card just folds to board wipes, folds to aggression, folds to everything. Rastakhan's really sucks and this card really highlights it. After resetting our power creep with Rastakhan's Rumble, Rise of Shadows begins the slow climb of power creep that basically hasn't stopped up until the sets we have today. Heist Baron Togwaggle has to be the strongest card from this set due to being incredibly flexible and a super powerful win con. Rogue decks easily had one of the best lackey cards in the game, giving them an easy way to fulfill Heist Baron Togwaggle's condition, and all of the different options that you got from Heist Baron Togwaggle give you tons of power. Being able to draw 0 cost cards from your deck, instantly applying power to the board. If you had no cards in deck, you could still pick the Crown and get large legendary minions to influence the board. Talon's Goblet gave you tons of value if you ran out of cards in your hand, and the Golden Kobold let you refresh your hand if you simply ran out of ways to win in your deck. This card was incredibly powerful and definitely saw play in tons of rogue decks all the way up until lackeys rotated out of standard. Some honorable mentions from Rise of Shadows have to be Kalecgos. This card originally cost 10 mana and got buffed to 9 recently, however its 10 mana body was still incredibly powerful. Being a 4/12 is pretty decent stats for 10 mana, not to mention that it gives you a large free spell that can easily both clear the board or grant you additional value depending on the situation required. It's also a must kill body because that 0 mana first spell each turn would keep recurring over and over again for as long as you had Kalecgos in play, leading to large mana cheat not only the turn you cast the Kalecgos but also every turn coming afterwards. Kalecgos was simply a very strong card for almost any late game mage deck that was printed at the time. Beginning with the free legendaries that were given out, Archmage Vargoth has to be one of the more powerful ones that were given to Hearthstone players' hands. This is a 4 mana 2/6 that casts a spell that you've cast every single turn at the end of the turn. Not only does this lead to you being able to combo a cheaper spell with him to recast the moment you play Vargoth, this also combos if you have him in play on turn 4 and your opponent cannot answer him. The 2/6 body is relatively hard to deal with on turn 4, and being Vargoth, being able to recast a spell every single turn gave great value, and because it was neutral, it saw play in tons of different decks. This card is a muscular threat, gave you great value, and had great synergy with large spell costs. Vargoth is a classic card from Rise of Shadows. Following the theme of large, expensive legendary minions that require a lot of energy to make work, we have Fel Lord Betruk, the worst card from Rise of Shadows. This card, like the Boogie Monster, has very bad stats for the cost, and it requires both deck setup, being you needing to have large minions in your deck with good death rattles to draw, so that way you can take advantage of the rush effect. It also requires that you have card draw in your deck, so that way you can draw them the turn you play Betruk. Not to mention that this card only has 7 health, meaning that you probably won't be able to get it for more than 1 turn of card drawing effects, and those cards have to still be in your deck when you draw Betruk, and then you play your draw spells to redraw into more minions. Betruk, even though it seems like it could have had potential, costing 8 mana and having 7 health was simply too high of a cost to be worth setting up your entire deck to make this effect work. Saviors of Uldum reintroduced Highlander in a powerful way with this card, Zephrys the Great. This is the most flexible card of all time, checking the board state for the perfect card that you need from the classic set. If you needed damage, he would give you damage. If you needed value, he would give you value. If you played him early, he could give you another powerful threat or ramp to play on turn 3. This card really did everything and forced all decks to consider becoming Highlander because this neutral Highlander payoff was so powerful. Not to mention, he is still even good stats for the cost as a 2-mana 3/2, so even played on turn 3, this card is still super powerful and fills your curve any single turn of the entire game. Zephrys truly was a great card. Following the theme of powerful neutral minions printed in Saviors of Uldum, we have Seamat. Seamat is a super powerful option for any mid-range or late-game decks, being a flexible board clear option, being able to gain Wind Fury and Rush, clearing multiple minions, not to mention that it could just be a single board clear option with Rush and Divine Shield. Not to mention, it is also good stats for the cost. If you give Divine Shield Wind Fury, he ends up being a huge threat, and if you give him Taunt, he can end up holding off your opponent's board on his own. Seamat did basically everything and was a super good example of a powerful, neutral 7-mana minion. In addition to Highlander, quests were also reintroduced in Saviors of Uldum, and the best pick for me has to be Untapped Potential. This card gives a reward of becoming Fandral Staghelm, having all of your choose one effects become choose both effects instead. This card was both powerful back when you could both play a 4-mana card that forced you to answer it. By having Untapped Potential be your thing, it also allows you to build large boards, lots of value, and has a very low cost in Druid, which gets more mana than any other class to complete this quest. Untapped Potential certainly gave Druid a different way of playing the game and was very powerful with any choose one effects that Druid would end up playing. This card definitely had a lot of potential inside of it. On the other hand of quests, we have the worst card in my opinion in Saviors of Uldum, which had to be Bizarre Burglary. This card was very easy to complete the quest of only adding 4 different class cards to your hand, which was very easy for Rogue to do. However, the hero power upgrade wasn't really what a value Rogue wanted. Giving a 3/2 blade, while as powerful for pushing damage to face, wasn't the best thing for board clear because you would only get the ancient blades after a few turns of waiting, not to mention that you both paid the card of Bizarre Burglary to put that hero power into play in the first place. It only gives you value after gaining those cards. It only upgrades your hero power by 2 power and not taking damage, which is, while powerful, isn't what Rogue really wants to do in this expansion. So that's why Bizarre Burglary is my pick for the worst card in Saviors of Uldum. We've reached Descent of Dragons, and this is where power creep goes over the edge if you ask me. Galakrond the Tempest has to be one of the most powerful on-release decks ever seen in the history of Hearthstone. By having very easy invoke cards to simply upgrade your Galakrond to the Alakron Azeroth End version of the Shaman, this would not only give you a massive 7-mana 16/16 worth of stats with Rush and 5 armor, it also gave you 10 damage, a Pyroblast worth of burst in the Claw. Not to mention that if this wasn't enough for you, you still had Shutterwalk legal at this time, meaning that you could replay Shutterwalk and get Galakrond Azeroth and Battlecry again, giving you another massive amount of stats and another 10 damage burst to your opponent's face. This card forced so many different nerfs over the course of Shaman's lifetime, with Galakrond Azeroth and at the helm being the one large payoff that made the entire deck work. This card was completely absurd and was something that you simply had to see to understand how powerful and metagame warping this deck was. Continuing the trend of incredible power creep, this time Dragon Queen Naxxramas shows us why having a Highlander deck is so powerful in this age. Being a 9-mana 8/8 that gives you 2 other 0-cost dragons was simply too much for most Hearthstone decks to handle. Being able to slam down 3 massive dragons on 9 mana, not to mention that originally when this card was printed, you could get another Dragon Queen Naxxramas off of her own effect, leading to you having 4, 5, maybe an entire board come nothing from a completely empty board state of just playing one Dragon Queen Naxxramas. This card ended up getting nerfed so that way the dragons cost 1 mana, so you couldn't just slam down your entire hand on the table in one turn. However, this card was still extremely powerful even after that and made it definitely worth it to play a Highlander deck in this age. The final card in the honorable mentions has to be Kronk's Dragonhoof. This is the card that made all the Galakrond decks work. If without this card, I doubt they would be as powerful as they were. Being a powerful battle cry to give you basically the best card in your deck every time, and if you already had Galakrond, this card was even better, giving you a massive burst of damage, or a massive life heal, or board clear, or a huge board presence. This card basically did everything a Galakrond deck could ever want, and was super powerful. Not to mention that it's also a 6-mana 6/6, which is good enough stats on its own if you only played it on 6 to draw Galakrond. This card was a perfect card in any Galakrond deck and was an absolute must play. A pet favorite card of mine, but has to be one of the worst cards in Descent of Dragon, is Valor's Felgorge. This card is a powerful card draw card, giving you 7 mana to draw 4 cards and summon a 4/4 body, which doesn't sound that bad. However, in this era, this stats of 4/4 for 7 is simply too low cost, and because this is in Warlock, the class that has the easiest access to card draw, and the fact that it increases your hand size to 12, which would be nice in card draw decks, it is simply just too slow to work against high tempo versions of other decks or higher value versions of other decks by just paying 7 mana to simply draw the cards. In this era of Hearthstone, drawing cards isn't good enough. You have to put the cards into play to win the game too. The train keeps on rolling, and this introduces Demon Hunter, probably the most busted unreleased class ever introduced to Hearthstone. Ashes of Outland simply went above and beyond in making Demon Hunter the best class in the game when it first came out, and this is one of the most obvious examples of it. Skull of Gul'dan. This card originally released at 5 mana and discounted 3 cards you drew off of its effect by 3 mana, giving you a 4 mana positive effect on a card draw effect that drew you 3 cards. This card got nerfed to 6 mana and still saw tons of play, being a powerful combo tool, giving you discounts on your combo cards, an aggro tool allowing you to slam down even more cards on the board for very cheap and refueling your hand. This card basically saw play in any different version of Demon Hunter decks, with the only cost being that it had to be in the side of your hand, which Demon Hunter was very good at enabling anyway. This card was absolutely absurd. Card draw, mana cheat, aggro, combo, what more could you possibly want from a card? Another super powerful combo card from Ashes of Outland has to be Kael'thas Sunstrider. This card was not only a 6 mana 4/7, which is pretty decent stats and hard to remove, but when you played him, he made it so that your 3rd spell costs 0. Eventually that would get nerfed to 1 mana because 0 mana spells that you can play on turn 6 are super duper powerful. You can enable huge combos with this card by enabling 0 mana and 1 mana spells, comboing into large 9 or 10 mana spells cast off Kael'thas Sunstrider. This card was neutral, meaning that it could go into any class and enable insane combos basically all over the entire game from standard to wild. This card definitely deserved the nerf and is super powerful. Another card that really shows how busted Demon Hunter was on release has to be Imprison Antane. If you just look at the stats on this card is a 5 mana 10/6. Now while the card does have the downside of starting dormant for 2 turns, meaning you don't get those big stats right away, after 2 turns it wakes up and does 10 damage amongst your entire enemy board, leading to it almost usually on its own clearing the enemy board, and if your opponent didn't have a board to clear, it pyroblasted your opponent in the face. There was no way to play around this card, not to mention before you thought of the body that came after the massive board clear or face damage that Imprison Antane put out. This card was an absolute menace and got nerfed to 6 mana because it was simply too good in the aggressive Demon Hunter decks. And here we go again with another legendary that really has no reason to exist. We have Alinar. This card is bad stats for the cost at a 5 mana 7/3. It basically dies to almost any card in the game that costs way less than it. However, it has a super powerful effect of summoning a 0/3 minion afterwards. A 0/3 minion that does resurrect your Phoenix at the end of the turn if it gets that far. However, most of the time if your opponent didn't struggle with dealing with a 7/3 minion, they're not going to struggle dealing with a 0/3 minion, and that's why this has to be the worst card from Ashes of Outland. Still powered up, Scholomance Academy released having many powerful cards, and one of them that is the most powerful in my opinion has to be Jandis Baroth. This card is pretty low stats for the cost at a 5 mana 2/1. However, it summons 2 random 5 cost minions, basically making it so that way you guaranteed got more stats for the cost than what you paid for when you played Jandis. Not to mention that this battle cry in Rogue and Mage decks was retriggerable or copyable, leading to you having many Jandises come down into play and causing huge boards for very cheap. This card got nerfed to 6 mana and still summoning the 5 cost minions simply because it gave you so many stats for so little cost. This isn't even mentioning the mind game you get to play when you secretly pick one of the minions to have 1 health as opposed to its normal amount of health. This card was just an absolute must play in any aggro, combo, or even control style of decks in either Mage or Rogue. This card was super powerful. If we're talking about pure power, the best card in Scholomance Academy before the nerfs has to be Mindrender Elucia. This card was insane at release. It swapped hands and decks with your opponent for only 2 mana, which eventually got nerfed to 3 mana and then nerfed into the ground so the effect didn't even work at all anymore. In a deck, they simply would play an aggressive priest deck and swap hands with your opponent as early as turn 2, leading to you being unable to do anything to stop the priest from beating your face down. Not to mention, in a combo or control deck, you could still play Mindrender Relucia and pull powerful value engines or combo cards that your opponent needed out of their deck and or hand. This card was simply too flexible and too powerful, and when it was discovered to be powerful in aggro decks, giving your opponent no options to clear your board on a game-ending turn, similar to Lotheb, it was too much and had to get nerfed so that way it would only copy the hand of your opponent to your side and not force your opponent to not be able to play anything. Another contender for one of the best cards ever printed has to be Secret Passage. Now this card is a 1 mana draw 5 that got nerfed to a 1 mana draw 4. Now, and even though your cards that you get in your original hand get replaced by new cards, you still redraw your old hand after your Secret Passage is finished, meaning that you effectively get brand new 5 cards to play with. And if you have any cards that draw more cards or discover cards, those cards still get added to your new hand after the Secret Passage is finished. In Rogue, having a 1 mana draw 5 was obviously too powerful and needed to get to 4 mana, and that card still saw tons and tons of play up until Secret Passage was removed from Standard. In this era of Hearthstone, we're starting to get into the phases where the bad cards aren't exactly completely unplayable, but just are not up to snuff in comparison to the powerful things the classes could be doing otherwise. And that card that is for this set of Scholomance Academy has to be Shando Wildclaw. This card looks like a pretty good legendary for Beast Druids or Hunters, both classes which are known for playing Beasts. However, requiring the setup of playing an entire Beast deck and then requiring to draw Shando early so that way it could buff your deck made this card not that intense or enticing early game in Hunter or Druid strategies. Late game transforming into a Beast could be nice, however that required you to stick a Beast on the board and then have that card live to the next turn, meaning that Shando Wildclaw really didn't see play in either aggressive or controlling Beast versions of Druid or Hunter, leading to it seeing basically no play. Whilst you can definitely see Hearthstone's developers attempting to bring back the power creep with the release of the Darkmoon Faire, there are definitely still standout cards amongst these that are very powerful, and I'm going to start with Il'gynoth. This card was a super powerful combo enabler that enabled you to kill your opponent for ridiculously high life totals thanks to its ability to turn lifesteal into damage to your opponent as opposed to healing to yourself. This combined with other cards that would boost your spell damage and boost your spell's ability to deal damage to your opponent's face thanks to the Il'gynoth led to you dealing up to 64 damage in one combo. Not to mention this deck had a very high skill ceiling as all of those lifesteal spells that you play in your deck not only lead to combos that kill your opponent but also lead to longevity against different aggro strategies. Il'gynoth, very powerful combo card that saw lots of play in Demon Hunter. Another super powerful card from the Darkmoon Faire has to be Ringling's Rifle, the card that saw tons of play in Hunter decks over its entire time in Standard. This 4 mana 2/2 weapon gave you 4 mana worth of value by giving you 2 free Hunter Secrets, not to mention that you could discover the Hunter Secret that was most applicable to either your board state or the matchup at the time. This card not only enabled secret decks and did damage to your opponent's face, two things Hunters love to do, it also gave you randomness, making your opponent forced to play around many more secrets than they normally would be able to. Ringling's Rifle was an absolute classic from Darkmoon Faire. Arbor Up is a great example of the power creep going on in Druid and all the other classes of Hearthstone at the time, giving you 2/2/2 treants and then giving them an effective +2/+1. This card on its own gave you a pretty large board for 5 mana, not to mention that any other cards you had in play at the time also get that 2/+1 buff. This card made strong token decks a viable option in Druid basically on its own, enabling decks with Arbor Up was super easy and very, very thoughtless. Great stats for the cost and a super powerful card for Druid token. Another very interesting card, but pretty bad card from Darkmoon Faire has to be the Deck of Chaos. This card had a very, very strenuous deck building requirement requiring your minions to all have very specific costs and powers so that way you could play them for cheap after swapping them with Deck of Chaos. However, because you have to play Deck of Chaos first before these minions get swapped and it costs 5 mana, it almost guaranteed makes it that so that way your deck has a bunch of minions that you can't actually end up playing until you've played the Deck of Chaos. This clearly very powerful effect was priced a little bit too high at 5 mana and was simply too hard to make work in most strategies that Warlock could pull off at the time, and that is why it is the worst card from Darkmoon Faire. And now we've reached the Forge and the Barrens set, the beginning of the end for Hearthstone if you ask me, and one of the best cards in this set has to be this card, Refreshing Springwater. This card would be an absolute dream in any single mage deck over the course of Hearthstone's history and still would be today, giving you free 2 draw and giving you all the mana that you spent on the Refreshing Springwater back for free. This card was originally 4 mana and was forced to get nerfed to 5 mana, so you had to play at least some mana for the ability to draw 2 free cards from your deck. Not to mention that there were ways to discount this card, leading to you getting a positive mana effect off of this card draw spell. This card was an absolute dream for Mage and is definitely the best card in Forge and the Barrens. A very frustrating card from Fortune Barrens has to be Far Watch Post, a must-kill early game threat that comes down as early as turn 2 and has good stats for the cost. This card originally had 4 health, making it incredibly difficult to remove on turn 2, and then almost guaranteed giving your opponent 2 mana worth of extra cost on the cards that they drew on the turn you played it and the turn afterwards, making it so that way Far Watch Post not only gave you free stats because your opponent effectively got 2 less mana over the course of playing those cards, and this card came down on turn 2 and was a must-answer threat, further hamstringing your opponent's plays. This card got nerfed to 3 health, so that way it was possible to answer this on turn 2 without having to go into serious debt in terms of the cards that you drew off the Far Watch Post. This card was a great early impact and late game impact card to play in almost any deck because it was neutral. Another absolute dream card for Rogue that had to come out during this set, and that card is Field Contact. This card compared to Gadgetzan Auctioneer makes it an absolute laughingstock, being a 3 mana 3/2 that gives you a card whenever you play a Battlecry or combo card, which, not to mention, in Rogue is most of the cards that you're going to play anyway. This led to you being able to rip through your deck in an absolute blistering pace once you got up to enough mana to play Field Contact with any other Battlecry or combo card. This card was an absolute must-answer threat and was a super powerful combo enabler for Druid or for Rogue when it was in the game. You would think that Cargill Battlescar would see a lot more play than I mentioned that one of the best cards in this set happened to be one of the 3 battle posts in the game. However, Fortune Baron's worst card has to be Cargill Battlescar because he is simply 7 mana for simple stats, and in this era of Hearthstone, stats are not enough to win you the game. If you summon a full board of 5/5s after playing all of your battle posts, it doesn't even matter because that board will simply get cleared by a large board clear, and on turn 7 that is simply too slow and it requires more than just the 1 watch post in the deck to be good. The fact that this card was printed made it so that way you would think you could build a cool watch post deck, but this card simply never worked. And we've reached the Doomsday of Hearthstone, the most hated set of all time, united in Stormwind. And this card was one of the definite reasons why Hearthstone lost a large amount of the player base. It is Sorcerer's Gambit. This card was one of the most simple win cons in the game, giving you a permanent +3 spell damage when completed. Now, all 3 steps of the Sorcerer's Gambit were the same, which was simply to cast a Fire, Frost, and Arcane spell. Something really easy to do in Mage, the class with the most Fire, Frost, and Arcane spells. Not to mention that every time you completed one of the steps, you would draw a free card, meaning that you would easily be able to draw into more Fire, Frost, and Arcane spells to complete your quest simply. After completing your quest, probably by turn 4 or turn 5, you could play Arcanist Dawngrasp and gain your 3 spell damage and then combo kill your opponent on the following turn. This led to an incredibly toxic gameplay pattern where you required no min in your deck because you knew that your win con was going to be in your opening hand every game and you required absolutely nothing to set it up. Just play spells in your mage deck, a super simple win con. This card was nerfed to be +2 spell damage and yet still saw play because of how toxic this gameplay requirement was. Simply clear your opponent's board every single turn, freezing minions, destroying minions with fire and arcane spells until eventually you get spell damage +3 or +2 and then use that to slowly chip your opponent to death and win the game. Not only did we have one incredibly degenerate combo deck at the top of the metagame in the Mage deck, we also had a Warlock quest that also completely broke the game. That quest was the Demon Seed. Requiring you to take 10 damage on your turns, 8 damage before the nerf, this card would give you 3 life back after you paid that life. And paying life for cards was something that Warlock was very, very willing to do throughout all of Hearthstone's lifespan. Now, when you would draw all of these cards, you would be given the ability to play Blightborn Tamsin after taking all that damage, which makes it so that way damage you take on your turns goes to your opponent. This includes fatigue damage, and I believe if this card wasn't including fatigue damage, it would be very easy to play around. However, because when you take fatigue damage, it goes to your opponent, a very, very simple win con for the Demon Seed deck was to simply pay as much life as possible to draw as many cards as you could while healing off damage from your opponent. After around turn 8, you will have drawn your entire deck and played Blightborn Tamsin, and that way your opponent would not be able to do anything but die to the fatigue damage from the cards you drew from your deck. After that, you wouldn't have to rely on any minions or any board presence or any other aspect of the entire game. All you have to do is just rip through your entire deck and combo your opponent without any minions in play and they would simply die. Uninteractive, unfun, and incredibly powerful, the Demon Seed is one of the most powerful cards in Hearthstone's history. Another card which enabled this Demoncy deck, and has to be one of the most ridiculous cards ever printed in the game, we have Ruined Mithril Rod. Originally costing 3 mana and nerfed all the way up to 5 mana, if you drew 4 cards with Ruined Mithril Rod in play over the course of a couple turns, you would be able to discount the cost of all of your cards in your hand by 1, basically making it so that way Ruined Mithril Rod paid for itself and more, giving you a huge amount of mana cheat for absolutely free. If you paid 3 mana for this and only had 3 cards in hand, it would still be a positive effect of 3 mana. But this is in Warlock, the class with the most card draw in the game, so you would draw an entire grip's worth of 10 cards, discounted by 10 mana by your Ruined Mithril Rod, and then use those cards to draw more cards that discount by another 10 mana. This card enabled the absolutely degenerate ripping through of your entire deck in these Warlock decks, and led to you being able to play Blightborn Tamsin and easily kill your opponent as early as possible. This card would be absurd in any class, and Warlock was just the kicker it needed to absolutely ruin this metagame. It's funny to see how good this card is, and as I'm saying, it is the worst card in United in the Storm is Cornelius Roan. This card draws you 2 cards every single turn cycle, which seems like a lot of power. People would kill for this in a previous version of Hearthstone's metagame, where you had long late game battles where you wanted to draw cards. However, in this metagame, this card would draw cards and then you would simply die. It is simply too slow and too bad stats. It doesn't kill your opponent and it doesn't win you the game, therefore it has to be one of the worst cards in United in the Storm, because all of the other cards in the set do that. After the combo winter that came with United in Stormwind, Fractured and Alterac Valley came in and changed the metagame once again by introducing a super powerful aggro card in Drekthar, a 4-mana aggro finisher that requires it to be the top end of your aggro deck. However, when it came in, originally it would summon 2 minions from your deck for absolutely free, nerfed to only 1 minion because the board presence gained from playing Drekthar on 4 was an incredible amount, and because your deck was only 1 to 3 cost minions, you would usually have a super high tempo aggressive start before you slam down your Drekthar, slamming the door on your opponent and forcing them to die in turn 5 or turn 6 before they can really interact with you at all. Drekthar, super powerful card, definitely deserved the nerf. After Drekthar got nerfed, it really opened the door to super late game value decks that would be super powerful thanks to other cards printed in Fractured and Alterac Valley. One of them has to be Wild Heart Guff. This card was absolutely insane, allowing your mana to go up to 20, basically doubling your output against any slow control deck in the entire game. Not to mention that it also gave you Mana Crystal and a card draw when you played him initially. This card got nerfed several times, both nerfed to 6 mana and nerfed so that way the Mana Crystal you got off Guff's hero power and his play effect were both empty Mana Crystals, leading it so that way you couldn't gain tons of mana really early by playing Guff on turn 6. This card was super powerful and a druid's absolute dream. I would never dream of them bringing back a card like this because it is simply too powerful to get that much mana, that much card draw, not to mention the armor and the better hero power. Guff really did everything. Further slamming the door closed on any sort of slow fatigue strategies is Kazakusan. This card requires the low cost of you only playing 4 dragons over the course of the game, which is very easy to do if you just simply put some of the good dragons over the course of the game into play. Now, Kazakusan being an 8 mana 8/8 replaced your entire deck with custom treasures from the Duels game mode. These treasures are incredibly powerful and could easily wipe your entire board for free or give you a huge late game bonanza worth of threat, do massive burn damage to your face. Kazakusan really closed the door on any game, and in any deck that was willing to go to fatigue, you could simply stick Kazakusan in with a few dragons and easily win the game when you got up to that mana threshold. Kazakusan as an 8 mana card is super powerful and would be an absolute dream in any Hearthstone metagame before this. Big Demon Hunter decks have been something that have been trying to be done since Demon Hunter originally came out in the base set and was replaced with a super powerful aggro strategy, and Carnia Fellstole has to be one of the cards that is trying to make that deck archetype work. Though it seems similar to previous big demon archetypes from Warlock in the past, being a 6 mana 6/6 demon actually downgrades the stats on your big demon in your deck. Not to mention that the big demons with the big effects almost usually cost 6 or 7 mana anyway, leading to the fact that this card was just too much work to make work. You had to draw it with the good demons and then play it and have the good demons still be in your deck, and it doesn't even cheat you that much mana in the first place. This deck archetype was bad and this card did nothing to help. In this powercraft metagame, you definitely have to print a super powerful card to make it so that way it will see play, and Voyage in the Sunken City didn't leave us behind by giving us some of the super powerful colossal cards, the best of which I think was Nelly. Nelly, the 7-cost warrior colossal minion was super big at a 5/5 that came with a 2/6 taunt. Now this taunt was annoying to get through if you were an aggro or a mid-range deck trying to apply pressure to your very slow late game warrior deck. Not to mention that if you killed the pirate ship, they would get 3 different pirates from the crew that they had recruited into the pirate ship, and these initially cost 1, leading to that way you would have a massive board for basically no mana to slam down if they actually ended up clearing Nelly. And if they didn't clear Nelly, then you still had a big threat to slam your opponent with. This card was eventually nerfed though. The pirates only cost 2 less, so you couldn't get huge mana pirates down for incredibly cheap. Nelly's pirate ship was super powerful, and Nelly definitely earns a spot as the best Voyage to the Sunken City card. Voyage to the Sunken City also had some very good mid-range plays that would definitely see tons of play coming through the future of all of the Voyage to the Sunken City sets. One of them is definitely School Teacher. This 4-mana 5/4 seems pretty innocuous, just having decent stats. However, it discovers a 1/1 that gives you a free 3-cost spell to teach. Now, the spell doesn't always cost 3, but if you get a Discover, you can pick the spell that costs the most or is the most effective for the board state you're in. And then School Teacher more than makes up for its kind of mediocre stats and body by giving you a huge tempo swing when you play the Noggling. This card got nerfed to 4 attack just because you had to deal with the School Teacher when it came down, and then the tempo of the Noggling would follow up and apply even more pressure. So this card definitely deserved the nerf and is super strong. Blade Master Okani follows the trend of super powerful free legendaries given out by the Hearthstone team, and this one is also a 4-mana 2/6. However, when it comes in, it freely counters a minion or a spell your opponent's plays based on which one you secretly picked. Now, having the option to pick was really good because you could tailor your pick around what your opponent was playing and get a card guaranteed almost every time, because when you played Blade Master Okani, your opponent wouldn't know if you picked minion or spell, and then would usually be forced to play into it unless they had removal for it on board at the time. Not to mention, a 2/6 body is pretty hard to remove when played on turn 4, giving you a decent statted body and letting you follow up with even more aggressive plays if the secret counter was not triggered on its own. Blade Master Okani, being a neutral minion, saw plays in tons of aggro and mid-range decks. Though it makes me sad, the worst card in Voyage to the Sunken City has to be Pirate Admiral Hooktusk. This card gives you extra value to your pirate deck, which seems like a nice thing considering you're going to be dumping a lot of your pirates into play all the time. It's not really what you're looking for in your aggressive strategy to have a large 7-mana minion on top that's only a 7/7. Originally, this card also cost 8 for an 8/8, which was simply too much mana to be able to do anything in the late game. While this card is an absolute killer against any sort of control strategy, those strategies are already well positioned against aggressive pirate decks, which is the deck that Pirate Admiral Hooktusk fit into. This deck was simply not fit for Hooktusk, and sadly she did not see very much play when she was printed. Alright, here we have a spicy one. Here at Murders at Castle Nathria, we have the absolute best card that got printed, which has definitely got to be Prince Renathal. This card was absolutely insane, and another game warping start of game effect, which gave you a 40 health starting life total, assuming you added another 10 cards to your deck in addition to the 30 it started with. This card was great in any control deck and mid-range deck, giving you extra survivability against control deck or combo decks, which were intended to kill you from 30 and not kill you from 40. Not to mention, against aggro and mid-range decks, you would have extra life gain and sustain to be able to hold out against those decks until you could turn the corner with board clears and healing to keep yourself out of range of dying. This card gave a huge buff to all slow decks and slowed the metagame around an absolute ton, forcing control decks to be control decks, which had 40 card decks to last forever. This card got nerfed to 35 health instead of 40, so that way there would be some counterplay for combo and aggro decks against it, and if you ask me, the nerf was definitely deserved. Prince Renathal basically made it a combo player's dream, because the more cards in your deck, the less likely you are to fatigue in a combo mirror, the less likely you are to die to a combo deck, the less likely you are to die to a control mirror, the less likely you are to die to an aggro deck. This card was simply good against absolutely everything, and is still good even after the nerf. Continuing the trend of super powerful Nathria neutral legendaries is Sire Denathrius, a card that saw tons of play in tons of decks. Now, being a 10 mana card has a large bar to fill. However, a 10 mana 10/10 lifesteal is no small body, not to mention that the reason you mostly played this card was for its huge battlecry effect, which dealt damage to each enemy for 5 and increasing every time one of your friendly minions died while this was in your hand. This was really easy to accomplish when it was at Infuse 1 endlessly, so you could constantly have a swarm of bodies that you recruited onto the board. If you were a paladin, if you were a shaman, or any deck in between, you could play Sire Denathrius at the end to chunk your opponent for a huge amount and heal you like a Reno Jackson would. This card became a combo enabler, this card became a control staple, this card was a mid-range threat, an aggro top end, this card really did it all. Sire Denathrius, one of the best cards in Castle Nathria. Another powerful neutral legendary from Castle Nathria has to be Theotar the Mad Duke, originally priced as a 4 mana 3/3 getting nerfed to a 6 mana 4/4. There's a lot of reason why this card was super powerful in so many decks. This card is one of the few instances in Hearthstone of targeted hand disruption, allowing you to rip combo cards from combo decks, value engines from value decks, and also be able to stop any mid-range deck from playing Theotar against you by you Theotaring their Theotar. This card gives you great value and removes value from your opponent, and the only cost you have to pay is playing a relatively understated minion on the board. The only thing Theotar isn't good against is aggro decks, and those weren't the most popular with powerful effects like Renathal and Denathrius running around keeping you alive. Theotar absolutely deserved to get nerfed to 6 and is still super powerful even at that cost. There are many cards in Castle Nathria that you could consider for the last slot, but I had to put it to Sinstone Graveyard. This card is an absolute menace. Now, if you remember from Classic, Edwin Van Cleef was one of the most powerful combo cards in the game, being a 3 mana huge threat that comes down and slams your opponent for tons of damage, and Sinstone Graveyard was very similar to this. This card got nerfed so much, it originally was 2 mana and gave the ghost that you played stealth, meaning that you could play on turn 2, Sinstone Graveyard, and then combo off on turn 3, summoning a massive ghost to chunk your opponent on the next turn guaranteed thanks to the stealth. This is a mana investment so that way you can play the 3 mana before the fact you have your combo turn, leading to an extra effective 3 mana on the turn you combo that your opponent can do nothing about, because there is very, very limited ways to remove Sinstone Graveyard from the board before your opponent combos. This is probably one of the best rogue combo payoffs in the entire game and definitely deserves a slot in the honorable mentions of Castle Nathria. Demon Hunter is continuing to get the short end of the stick with their legendary from Castle Nathria being Krithis the Voracious. This card is a very large 4 mana 7/7, which was really good many years ago in Hearthstone, but nowadays it isn't even good enough to see play, and it also comes with the massive downside of you discarding your entire hand, which is pretty bad for if you want to win the game. Now, the death rattle of drawing 3 cards is pretty good, however, because of the fact that you played this in a bad archetype already, which is an aggro Demon Hunter deck, it has a lot of downside if anything ever goes wrong with Krithis getting silenced or polymorphed or anything happening to this card. Your 3 cards are down the drain and then you're just top decking for the rest of the game. 4 mana 7/7 is pretty good, but it just isn't good enough in this era of Hearthstone. Now we have March of the Lich King with one of probably the best cards Hearthstone has ever seen in the neutral slot, Alastor Bloodsworn. This card was so good that it would see play in aggro, control, or combo decks, or mid-range decks. Any single deck you could want, this card would be in it. Alastor was a 2 mana 2/2 that gave you a 5 mana 5/5 that gave you an 8 mana 8/8, and all of them had beneficial effects when they were played with the mana first enabled. Having a 2 mana 2/2 that dealt 2 damage on turn 4 was already good enough to see play in tons of decks, not to mention that you got other super powerful mid-range cards that would heal you for 5 health when it came to play, and a super powerful late game card that dealt a bunch of damage to your opponent, finishing them in aggro decks or clearing your board in a control deck. Alastor was nerfed and had the damage lowered on the final amount and had the mana thirst levels increased on the other 2 amounts. This nerf was super necessary because Alastor, even after this nerf, still saw tons of play, a super powerful late game win con in control decks, a super combo powerful burst option in aggro decks. This card really did it all and was the most powerful legendary in March of the Lich King. Another super powerful card from March of the Lich King has to be Nubercon, a super old card, but a super powerful one when reprinted into the Druid class, because this card enabled massive combos, being an 8 mana 7/7, but that part of the card was really not what you cared about, because the 8 mana was all you needed to get the 5 armor, originally 8 armor, and then make your next 3 minions that you cast cost armor instead of mana, which also got nerfed. It used to be unlimited. This card allowing you to dump as many minions as you want from your hand, or 3 minions as you want from your hand, for literally no mana, made it so that way if you had any armor to start with after playing your Nubercon, you could fully combo your opponent on turn 8 with no other help. This card was so powerful, it only gave you 5 armor and still saw a bunch of play as just a powerful combo enabler. It gives you healing, it gives you a body, it gives you combo enabling. What more could you want from a Druid card? One of the funniest cards to be good in March of the Lich King, not being a Lich King card, is Shockspitter. Shockspitter was one of the most powerful hunter cards we'd ever seen because it was a 2 mana 2/2 that dealt a massive amount of damage. It got nerfed to 4 mana, basically removing it from the game. However, when it cost 2 mana, you could easily see Shockspitters doing up to 5 or 6 damage for only 2 mana if you simply attacked every turn of the game. Something Hunter is easily equipped to do with as many cheap, high durability weapons in the class. You could get a massive amount of damage over the course of the game using your normal Hunter weapons, hero power, and minions, and then you could finish your opponent off with a large combo of Shockspitters dealing up to to 18 damage or more with just one Shock Spitter combo. This card was insane, apparently, especially when paired with multiple copies of itself, ways to copy it, and Brand to copy the Battlecry effect. This card was super powerful and definitely deserved to get nerfed. The worst card from March of the Lich King has to be Bone Lord Frostwhisper, a card so bad that it got you killed and was really bad when you randomly ended up with it in your hand or in play. This card has a super powerful effect of making the first card for the rest of the game that you play cost 0. Now this effect is super powerful, however the fact that it is on a 6 mana 6/6 and is a death rattle means it requires an actual good amount to actually set this effect up, and not to mention that once this effect goes off you will die in 3 turns, meaning you only have 3 turns to pull off whatever combo you wanted to do with this effect. If you were just playing this effect for pure value, you would simply die, meaning that this was forced to be a combo card and very slow one at that, being a 6 mana death rattle that could get silenced or bounced or polymorphed or something. There are so many ways to break up this card's combo, and this is only a legendary, meaning you have to draw it. This card has so many hoops to jump for, and at the end of the day, if you don't have all those hoops, you just end up killing yourself. So easy to disrupt. This card was definitely the worst card in March of the Lich King. Alright, Festival of Legends time. Festival of Legends had a lot of powerful cards, but the most powerful card has to be this neutral legendary Pozic, Audio Engineer. This card has great stats for the cost at a 4 mana 5/4 that got nerfed to a 4 mana 4/4, but that isn't it, because those stats would be really good a long time ago. This card has amazing stats because it gives your opponent 2 3/3 Boombots to the hand. Now these Boombots that were added to your opponent's hand would cost 3 mana for 3/3, meaning that they weren't that enticing to play as they were pretty poor stats and they took up most of your opponent's turn if you played them. And if you didn't play them and you tried to kill Pozic, it would give you those guys for free, meaning that this was effectively a 10/10 or an 11/10 before the nerf worth of stats for 4 mana. Obviously absurd. And if your opponent did spend 3 mana, you effectively got a 1 mana 4/4 and they got a 3 mana 3/3. Not really the best for your opponent. This card had a lot of flexibility and an actual lot of power and played in aggro and mid-range decks and disrupting your opponent, giving them less time to deal with your board and pushing more damage to your face. Even though this card is surprisingly powerful, it gives you tons of power making potential and tons of aggro pressure in different archetypes. This card, being a neutral 4 cost, was super strong. More powerful Festival of Legend cards getting nerfed more. We have Hollow Hound coming in here with nerfs from 6 health to 4 health. This Beast and Undead card had tons of synergies with different archetypes in Hunter and also Death Knight. This card, giving you a ton of lifesteal and board clear, made it secure to play on turn 6 against aggro decks to heal you up and keep you out of range of the powerful abilities that those decks had to burst you. Not to mention that if you buffed this card up, it became a massive late game threat that not only kept you out of range of control decks burst options, but it also gave you big board clear effects for those large board minions from control decks. This card was an excellent card and definitely deserved the nerf. Now for another game warping effect with decks being swapped. Much like Mind Riddle Lucia, we have Tony, the King of Piracy. This card was an excellent combo breaker because it swapped your deck with your opponent's deck and gave you a card draw if you finaled it. This enabled you to swap decks with your combo opponent and then rip the combo cards out of their deck before they could gain access to them. Not to mention that this card also was a super powerful combo enabler with cards like the JR, which allowed you to destroy your entire deck. If you stole your opponent's deck at this time, then you could delete your opponent's entire deck and then they would have nothing to play with after Tony dies and gives their deck back. This card was nerfed to just copy your opponent's deck instead of swapping it, showing that stealing your opponent's stuff is really unfun and really powerful effect in Hearthstone overall. A card that you would look like and seem like it would be really overpowered, but didn't actually end up seeing a lot of play in Festival of Legends is Bounce Around featuring Garona. This card looks like it sets up for huge combo turns in the Rogue archetype by returning all friendly minions to your hand and making them cost 1 for the turn. This allows you to make a massive board and then bounce it all back to re-trigger any battle cry or combo effects that you applied. However, the combo setup for this card is a lot higher than it would first seem, because not only do you need the 3 mana to play Bounce Around, you also need the mana afterwards to recast all of your minions. Cards like Shadow Step give you back the cost of the card by discounting the minion that you bounce back for 2 and also costing 0 mana. This large mana investment makes it so that you already require having a board in play. So that means you have to have big minions that you want to bounce back, but you can't play big minions and bounce around on the same turn because they cost too much mana. Bouncing small minions gives you too low of a cost. Bouncing high minions is too much cost in your deck building. So this card requiring a lot of setup and actually ended up seeing very little play despite how powerful this effect looks like. During the Titans expansion, we got to see Yogg-Saron once again take over the entire metagame with probably one of the most powerful cards Hearthstone has ever seen, Yogg-Saron Unleashed. The original printing of this card cost 1 less for each spell you cast this game, and like Arcane Giant, this card would come down and absolutely slam your opponent with its large body and super powerful Titan effects. Being a 0 mana mind control is already powerful enough to make your opponent losing on board the moment you play this guy for 0 mana. Induce Insanity is a basically 0 mana board clear of your opponent's board, making it so that way on your combo spell decks you could combo off and then end with a board clear to set up for your next turn. Not to mention that Tentacle Swarm also gave you a bunch of value in the late game if you ran out of things to do. This low cost mind control and board clear made it so that way spell spam combo decks were once again the top of the metagame and enabled them to absolutely crush aggro decks even though those were supposed to be their worst matchup. This card got nerfed to completely remove the mana cheating effect and simply cost 9 mana, which still made it a great control finisher, however removed these spell spam decks from the metagame, taking over with Yogg-Saron Unleashed. Another super powerful combo Titans card has to be Sif, which is a super powerful mage legendary that gives you spell damage for each spell school you've cast this game. Once again, mage is the easiest class to go through different spell schools with, and by having Sif as your top end finisher, you could easily burst your opponent to death with only a few spells, getting spell damage of +5, 6, or even 7 if you got through all of the different spell schools. Incredibly easy to activate, a super huge payoff, an absolute dream for any mage player in the previous decade. And here, once again, we have a 4 mana neutral legendary minion that saw a ton of play. We have Ignis, the Eternal Flame. Battlecry, if you forged a card this game, which is pretty easy to do, there's a lot of powerful forward options that you could easily slot into your deck. You get to craft a custom weapon. Much like Kazakus of old, this card gave you a ton of late game value if required, being a large 10 mana weapon that would absolutely burst your opponent down and give you tons of value. This also made it so that way you could forge cards when you were limited on options. If you needed a 1 mana weapon to clearly clear the board, or if you needed a 3 mana weapon to be anti-aggro and heal you up or clear the board again. This card was a powerful burst option, a powerful control option, a powerful aggro option, a powerful mid-range option. This card really did it all. Any deck that was willing to play a forge card would absolutely include Ignis, the Eternal Flame. A card that feels really out of place to me has to be this card, Hodir, Fodder of Giants. This card is an 8 mana 8/8, which is already pretty poor stats at this era of Hearthstone, and it sets your next 3 minions you play to be 8/8 in stats. While that is a pretty powerful effect, having to wait till 8 mana to just get 8/8 stats on future minions is a lot of setup, and not to mention that you also have to find a way to draw Hodir in your Hunter deck, which is one of the weakest class for card draw specific cards in the entire game. Hodir is too much work and just a large amount of stats just for a big cost. This card is a lot of setup and not that much payoff. You need to go so much work to make Hodir work. This card will never see any play. Moving on now, we have Showdown in the Badlands, and this card that is right here has to be absolutely ridiculous and one of the most broken cards that has ever seen print. It is Reno Lone Ranger. This card is another Highlander card that is completely broken and limits your opponent's entire board to 1 space and completely clears it on its own. This card is so powerful that it basically wins you the game when you play it, because your opponent can do almost nothing to respond in a way that contests your board after you play Reno. Not to mention that Reno also upgrades your hero power to give you health gain, infinite value, and even more damage to your opponent's face. There isn't anything that even is required of Reno to make it good, and this card is so good that it got played in many decks where there wasn't even a Highlander payoff. This card would later get nerfed to 10 mana because of how powerful it was, and would force you to actually play a Highlander deck, because this card was simply too strong to be played with duplicates in your deck. Honorable mentions for Showdowns in the Badlands have to go to Deep Miner Brand. This card is the brand of old, but is only allowed in Warrior, which means the combos you can pull off are a lot less degenerate, and he also costs twice as much at 6 mana, meaning that for the rest of the game, when you double up your battle cries, you won't be able to do it in the early game. Still, this card also requires that you have no duplicates your deck when you play it, giving you a further restriction on the brand effect, and this card was still super powerful just because of how powerful battle cries are in the modern age of Hearthstone. This card gives you value, gives you healing, and it only requires 1 turn on turn 6 worth of setup, enabling combos, enabling different one-shot kills off Odin effects or off weapons. This card really does it all. Deep Miner Brand is super powerful just like the brand of old, and definitely deserves a spot on this list. A relatively innocuous seeming card in Blind Eye Sharpshooter actually is one of the most powerful combo cards we have ever seen and led to an entire combo Demon Hunter deck on its own. Originally costing 3 mana, it said so that way every time you played a Naga you would deal 2 damage to a random enemy and then draw a spell, and then switch to the spell half where if you played a spell you would deal 2 damage and then draw a random Naga. If you played this card after getting any amount of mana discounts or very early game and it didn't get killed, you would instantly kill your opponent. This card could combo for so much power with cheap Nagas and cheap spells, over and over again, shooting your opponent for 2 damage in the face, one after another, after another, after another. This card eventually got nerfed to 4 mana so that you couldn't combo quite as early with it, which definitely helped to bolster the card's unplayability in the metagame. However, this card left scars on so many professional players because of how fast it would simply kill you from hand. There is very little you could do about the Blind Eye Sharpshooter when it came down. A super fun card here in Showdown to the Backlands has to be Slagmaw the Slumbering. However, it is definitely not what I would call a good card. Rush, Taunt, and 16/16 for 4 mana sounds absolutely absurd until you read the fact that it is dormant for 6 turns. Originally, it was dormant for 8 turns and got buffed to 6, and it was still simply too slow. 16/16 stats is huge, but if you have to wait at least 4 turns to get this guy down if you excavate a few times, it is a lot of work to get big statted minion, and the problem with just having a large guy on the board is that he still gets killed by all the same removal that anything else does. Too slow in aggro decks by skipping turn 4, too slow against combo decks that would just combo you by the time you awaken your guy or combo past your guy. Against control decks, he would simply die. This card really has lots of homes, but it's simply not good enough to play against any other decks in the metagame. Now we have Whizbang's Workshop and the reintroduction of Ziliax, one of the most powerful cards in the previous metagame and once again one of the most powerful cards in this metagame. This card was super flexible because you could craft your own custom Ziliax by combining any of the 2 of the 8 modules that were options on Ziliax's options when you were putting him into your deck. Super flexible, a powerful threat for swarm decks because of the ticking module, a powerful control deck option using the perfected module plus other options like power module or twin module. This card eventually got nerfed with the ticking module going up to 5 and then got further nerfed with many of the other modules having their effects changed. This powerful card was super playable in many aggro, control, combo. Almost any deck could find a place to slot in Ziliax, exactly how the card was designed to be played and a little bit too powerful if you ask me. Another powerful card from Whizbang's Workshop has to be the Playhouse Giant, another giant that we're seeing on the list that can discount it to 0 mana with a lot of ease. There's very many ways to combo several draw effects into one another in Hearthstone in this era, so the fact that it costs 20 mana for an 8/8 actually means that it doesn't cost that much. It has a mech tag, so it has different mech synergies, and it allows you to slam this 0 mana 8/8 down after playing a few cards that just cycle through your entire deck. Not to mention, by drawing lots of cards, you have a higher chance of drawing that Playhouse Giant and then getting a massive board as early as turn 4 or turn 5. Slamming down Playhouse Giant has to be one of the strongest things you can do in Whizbang's Workshop. Now we're coming back to another Priest Dragon that lets you take an extra turn. However, this one is way better than the previous ones that got printed. Timewinder Zarini has to be one of the best cards ever seen in Hearthstone. By only summoning 5 dragons, which would later get nerfed to 8 dragons, this card allows you to take an extra turn that your opponent gets to do basically nothing about. Once you have played those dragons and fulfilled that requirement, your opponent has to be in constant fear. If they ever leave you with a minion on the board, that card could basically get Wind Fury and hit you twice, not to mention the extra burst from the other minions like Zarina herself and other minions that you can play on the same turn you play Zarini. Not to mention that you can use this card for combos, you can use this card for free turns to get extra value, you can use this card to get extra mana for free wins if you just get ahead of your opponent. It's such a low cost for such a powerful effect. This card will only get stronger over time and definitely deserves nerfs so that you are forced to play it in more dragon focused decks. Timewinder Zarini is an absolute house of a card. Another large mana card with a large deck building requirement in Whizbang's Workshop has to be Pipsy Painthoof. Similar to previous bad cards in other decks, Pipsy Painthoof requires you to have a random Divine Shield, Rush, and Taunt minion in your deck when you play her to summon out. Now, this can be pretty good if you summon large Taunt, Rush, and Divine Shield minions. However, you require not only for those to be in your deck, you also are required to draw Pipsy and then actually randomly get those minions from your deck. This is a very, very slow card costing 7 mana to make a board, which we have seen before is already too late, and they still get mostly cleared by one large board clear. Large mana and a very answerable effect, not to mention that Pipsy is a death rattle effect, making her super duper slow. You both have to play her and then wait till the next turn to kill her off manually on your own. Just bad stats for the cost, a large amount of work to summon a big board. Pipsy is not worth the paint that she's put in for. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the video. If you have any ideas for other cards that should have been on the list, or if you just want to leave a comment saying that you made it to the end of the video, it would really be appreciated. Thanks for watching.